In this presentation, I want to share with you some social context for the Greek word charis, which impinges, I think, quite heavily on how we read that word when it occurs in the New Testament and how we think theologically about grace in the New Testament. I offer this presentation not as an example of how to do a word study, but simply as a presentation on a very important New Testament word, charis. If we were to survey just one text from the New Testament, for example, the letter to the Hebrews, we would find that charis, and this would not surprise us, that charis is indeed a very frequent term that shows up in especially the epistolary literature. So, for example, in Hebrews, we see him, namely Jesus, who for a little while was made lower than the angels, crowned with glory and honor because of the suffering of death, so that by the grace, the charis of God, he might taste death for everyone. Just a few chapters later, let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, of charis, that we may receive mercy and find grace, charis, to help in time of need. Then in one of the climactic warning passages, how much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has spurned the Son of God, and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has outraged the Spirit of grace? Again, charis. Shortly thereafter, see to it that no one fails to obtain the grace, the charis of God. And then, in a climactic location, rounding off the closing exhortation, therefore let us have grace, charis, for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And then in the closing, somewhat miscellaneous exhortations, do not be led away by diverse and strange teachings, for it is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, charis, not by foods, which have not benefited those devoted to them. And of course, in the very familiar closing to most New Testament letters, grace, charis, be with all of you. So what does charis mean for Greek-speaking inhabitants of the first century Mediterranean region? In what contexts would different senses of this word, charis, different meanings, be evoked, and what markers would signal a particular sense for the Greek-speaking reader or listener? That is to say, in all of the examples that I've just read, charis doesn't exactly mean the same thing across the board. Clearly, it must have a range of meanings. And then another question that rarely occurs to us as we look into the meaning of New Testament words, but which is nonetheless vitally important, were particular social contexts and or relationships associated with charis in its various senses, or in some number of its senses? And if so, how might these social contexts, these real-life, everyday contexts, inform its lexical use? In other words, inform our understanding of its meaning. Where would charis or grace language be at home in the everyday world of the first century hearers or readers of Hebrews? Where would they have been exposed to this language, perhaps regularly and repeatedly, beyond the assembly gathered in the early Christian house church to hear this sermon being read? It might surprise us to learn that charis, what we typically translate as grace, was not a religious word in the first century. Now, we largely only hear about grace in churches, in Christian contexts, in theological discourse. We talk about prevenient or justifying or sanctifying grace. We sing about amazing grace. We say that we are saved by grace, sometimes saved by grace alone, or saved by grace through faith alone. And this is the kind of the real world realm in which grace has a home. But in the first century, grace, charis, was an everyday word, and it was particularly a key word in social relationships that were defined by giving and receiving assistance and resources, relationships such as existed between friends, or between patrons and clients, or between benefactors and beneficiaries more generally. The multivalence, that is to say, the multiple senses or meanings of the word, is striking. Charis, according to the Bauer Dunker Arndt Gingrich lexicon, which is the premier Greek-English dictionary for New Testament studies, in this resource, charis is given 5 different lexical senses or meanings, which any one of which might be activated in a particular context. What seems to be a kind of larger sense of charis is given as the first meaning: a winning quality or attractiveness that invites a favorable reaction. We could think of this as a quality that finds favor in someone else's eyes. Hence, charis can be used to talk about beauty, winsomeness, grace in the sense of being graceful or attractive or gifted, graced by the gods or by God in some way, such that people seeing or interacting with such a person are favorably disposed toward that person. Grace could also, or I should say charis, could also speak of the disposition of a benefactor to render service to one who needs it. This is, in fact, Aristotle's definition of charis in his book, The Art of Rhetoric, Book 2, Chapter 7, Section 2. This is charis in the sense of the willingness of a patron or a friend to grant help of some kind to someone else. This same word, charis, could also denote the actual help or the gifts conferred, as in, for example, 2 Corinthians 8:19, where Paul speaks of the gift that he is administering, namely the collection being taken up for the church in Jerusalem. Charis can also be used in senses 4 and 5 here to talk about the response to a benefactor or a friend and to his or her gifts, namely gratitude. So charis could speak of the favor awakened by someone else's kindness or generosity, or charis could name the response to generosity. That is to say, the gratitude that a recipient of favor or a recipient of some gift or some assistance would show in return to the patron or friend or benefactor who has, in fact, helped. It has this meaning, sense number 5, when the orator Dio Chrysostom exclaims, "What is more sacred than honor or gratitude?" Charis. In the midst of an oration taking a city to task for failing to show proper honor and gratitude toward its public benefactors. I would point you there especially to oration number 31, paragraph 37. Grace, or charis, was the key word in the ancient social system of friendship, patronage, and benefaction. At least especially senses 2 through 5 have their home in these everyday real relationships, which are defined by the mutual exchange of favor or of favors. It's also easy to see how these senses, at least senses 2, 4, and 5, relate to sense 1, which was a quality that wins favor or that invites a favorable response or reaction, because both showing favor to someone and showing appropriate gratitude to a generous person both invite a favorable reaction. When we are looking at particular instances of charis, it's therefore, in the first instance, important to think about what phase of the relationship is in view. Are we talking about a benefactor giving, initiating an exchange? Are we talking about the thing that is given, the thing that is exchanged, that passes hands? Are we talking about the response that the recipient appropriately makes to the giver? Returning just for a moment to the instances that we noted in Hebrews, a good number of these make sense as, or rather make sense taking charis as the disposition to give help. So that, for example, in 2:9, Jesus' suffering of death allows him to taste death for everyone by the favor of God. This would be sense number 2, that is to say, by God's generous disposition to help human beings. That would probably be the sense in the first instance of charis in 4:16. Let's draw near to the throne of grace, that is to say, the place where generous disposition is to be found, namely God's throne. In order that we may receive mercy and find grace to help, this second instance is perhaps a toss-up between the sense of grace as a giver's favorable disposition and the sense of grace as the thing given, the help offered, the assistance offered. Going further in 10:29, outraging the spirit of grace, in this instance probably takes us back to the meaning of the generous disposition to help. The person who spurns God's Son, who shows disloyalty and ingratitude, has outraged the divine spirit that was graciously disposed, that was inclined to help, and in fact had acted to help in such a costly way. In 12:15, however, context might suggest that charis here has the third sense in the listing of Bauer's lexicon, namely the sense of gift, the thing given. See to it that no one fails to obtain the gift that God offers. Not obtain God's generous disposition, which really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but obtaining that which is given. That is probably the sense that is meant here. In 12:28, we have finally a good instance of the fifth sense. Not, therefore, let us have grace, but let us show gratitude. Let us show gratitude for receiving a kingdom that can't be shaken. In this passage, the second half of the verse, which in Greek is actually the first half of the verse, since we are receiving a kingdom that can't be shaken, already draws attention to the fact that God is bestowing a favor. So the proper act that follows upon this receiving of favor is to return favor. It is to show gratitude. So in this case, actually a much better translation than what we have in the ESV would be, therefore let us show gratitude. And then, of course, in the final instance, in 13:25, we're back to the sense of the favorable disposition of the giver. May God be favorable toward all of you. Hence, grace be with all of you. 13:9 is admittedly ambiguous. It is good for the heart to be strengthened by grace, to be confirmed by grace, to be rooted, to be given a stable place by grace. Is this by what God has given? Is it by the enjoyment of God's favorable disposition? Is it even strengthened, confirmed by being grateful for all that God has given? So there, it seems to me, the precise sense of grace that might be in mind for the author is more difficult to determine. Now, one of the things that I hope to show in the remainder of this presentation is that these are not just a bundle of meanings. These various senses of the word charis, these various meanings in different contexts, also point to the underlying social logic of grace, the social logic of these relationships that are marked by the giving and exchanging of favor, of beautiful acts of giving and returning gratitude. Now, many literary texts from the Hellenistic and Roman periods are what sociologists would call high context documents. That is to say, these texts presume a great deal of shared cultural and social knowledge and codes between the author and the audience. Codes that might be foreign to us, reading them about, 1960 years later from a different cultural location as well, from generally from America as opposed to the Mediterranean, so removed both in time and culture quite considerably. We, reading a text like the letter to the Hebrews, are not immediately in touch with those cultural patterns and values and codes that both the author of Hebrews and the congregation or congregations that received Hebrews knew, understood, took for granted, filled in automatically. In fact, we tend, when we read Scripture, to read the text in light of the cultural values, codes, relationships, assumptions that we know and that we take for granted. And thus we tend to import anachronistic and ethnocentric presuppositions into the ancient text. We need to work hard to gain the necessary knowledge about the social and cultural context that the author and the audience shared, so as to hear a text like Hebrews, or any New Testament text, as insiders would hear them. There are a few texts from the ancient world, however, that go out of their way, as it were, to let the reader in and to help him or her follow the discussion. So, for example, Seneca's book on benefits, from which you're about to get a snootful of quotations, takes as its object, its purpose, to explore a code of conduct, to explore the proper code of conduct for the giving, receiving, and returning of favors. The code of conduct that other documents from the first century simply presume is, in Seneca's On Benefits, given meticulous, explicit attention. It doesn't presume insider debates, but illustrates precisely what those debates are and how the different positions might play out in real-life interactions. It's a monologue that operates at a meta level above social interactions, not presupposing the dynamics at work in everyday speech and interaction, but purposefully laying those dynamics bare to view and examination. The classical rhetorical handbooks and much ethical literature, for example, Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or collections of advice from both Jewish and non-Jewish authors in the ancient world, operate similarly, explaining the codes that in daily interaction or speech might otherwise be presupposed by the actors or conversation partners. Texts like these provide access, as it were, to native informants, helping us, modern readers, enter into those social systems and construct the models that would be required for reading higher context documents like Hebrews, in which the social values and scripts of patronage and reciprocity, for example, are indeed presumed, but not explicated. In other words, these are the sorts of texts that can help us answer reliably the question, did people really think and act that way? And if so, why? So as we turn to Seneca's On Benefits, we read that the giving and receiving of aid and benefactions between friends or between patrons and clients was the practice that constitutes the chief bond of human society. The Greco-Roman world was held together by networks of favor and loyalty. The system did not lend itself to precise evaluations of favors exchanged, so that mutual commitment tended to be long-term. The point of the institution was not even exchange, but ongoing exchange, ongoing investment in one another's well-being and advancing one another's interests. Mutual bonds of favor and obligation provided the glue that maintained social cohesion. In such a society, gratitude becomes an essential virtue, and ingratitude, as Seneca puts it, the cardinal social and political sin. In a world in which wealth and property were concentrated into the hands of a very small percentage of the population, the majority of people often found themselves in need of assistance in one form or another, and therefore had to seek the patronage of those who were better placed in the world than themselves. Patrons might be asked to provide money, grain, employment, or land. The better connected persons could be sought out as patrons for the opportunities they would give for professional or social advancement. One who received such a benefit became a client to the patron, accepting the obligation, not explicit, but always understood obligation, to publicize the favor and his or her gratitude for it, thus contributing to the patron's reputation. The client also accepted the obligation of loyalty to a patron and could be called upon to perform services for the patron, thus contributing to the patron's power. The reception of a gift and the acceptance of the obligation of gratitude are inseparable. Sometimes the most important gift that a friend or a patron could give would be access to another patron within his or her own network. When I cannot get what I need or want through my immediate network of friends or patrons, the question becomes, who can connect me with the person who can grant me the assistance I need or desire? Modern anthropologists call such a person a broker, but the ancients had a word for such a person as well. Mediator, in Greek mesites. We find this actually often also in the letter to the Hebrews to talk about Jesus as mediator or broker. Brokerage or mediation was exceedingly common and personal in the ancient world. The letters of Pliny the Younger, governor of Bithynia, around 110 CE. Bithynia is a province in the northeast sector of modern Turkey. The letters of Pliny to the Emperor Trajan, for example, document Pliny's attempts to gain imperial benefits for Pliny's own friends and clients. The gift of access to Trajan, the emperor's favor, was itself a tremendous gift that further bound Pliny's clients to himself. It is also quite significant that Greeks, Romans, and Jews all used social relationships that they could observe among people whom they could see to talk about their relationships with the divine, whom they could not see. Not surprisingly, the model of clients to a great patron is prominent in such discussions, whether one is reading Aristotle, Seneca, Epictetus, Philo, or 4th Maccabees. Priests were often regarded also as mediators or brokers between the divine and humanity. Indeed, the Latin word for priest, pontifex, comes from two morphemes meaning bridge and builder. A pontifex is a bridge builder. The priest connects human beings and their various needs to the divine and the favor, the help, the assistance that the divine can give. Gods and human patrons stood along a continuum. The quality of the gifts might be radically different. The givers might be different in nature, but the nature and dynamics of the relationships were of a kind, resting along a continuum, as it were. As one moved further along this continuum, the possibility of ever fully returning the favor became more remote, and the generosity and graciousness inherent in the giving approached the perfection and freedom that was the ideal for all givers. But it was still a continuum. The trinity of senses held together by the one word charis, generous disposition, gift, and grateful response, already suggests implicitly what many moralists from the Greek and Roman cultures stated explicitly. Grace must be met with grace. Favor must always give birth to favor. Gift must always be met with gratitude. The person who accepted a benefaction in the ancient world simultaneously accepted the obligation to show gratitude. In Seneca's words, the person who intends to be grateful immediately while receiving should turn his or her thought to repaying. This ethos was visually depicted in the popular image of the three graces, three goddesses dancing hand in hand in a circle. This particular image is a fresco that was discovered among the homes in Pompeii, so an image that certainly predates 79 AD. Seneca turns to this image to interpret the ethos of grace, of charis, admittedly in Latin, gratia. Seneca writes, there are three graces, since, quote, there is one for bestowing a benefit, one for receiving it, and a third for returning it. They dance hand in hand because a benefit passing in its course from hand to hand nevertheless returns to the giver. The beauty of the whole is destroyed. Grace is defaced or disgraced if the course is anywhere broken, and it has most beauty if it is continuous and maintains an uninterrupted succession. There ought not to be such a thing as an isolated act of grace. An act of favor initiates a circle dance in which the recipients of favor must return the favor, that is, give again to the giver, both in terms of a generous disposition and in terms of some gift, whether material or otherwise. Only a gift requited is a gift well and nobly received. Depicting the facets of the grace relationship as goddesses also communicated the sanctity of the relationship. Showing gratitude was considered a sacred obligation, while ingratitude was ranked alongside sacrilege. Again, as Seneca would put it, to fail to return gratitude is a disgrace, and the whole world counts it as such. How is gratitude to be expressed or manifested? One prominent component of this response was to bring honor to the benefactor through one's own demeanor and through one's testimony to the generosity and virtue of the benefactor. Aristotle spoke of honor as the due reward for virtue and beneficence in the 8th book of his Nicomachean Ethics. Or, in Seneca's words, let us show how grateful we are for the blessing that has come to us by pouring forth our feelings, and let us bear witness to them not merely in the hearing of the giver, but everywhere. Seneca sternly warns that one should never accept a gift if one would be ashamed to acknowledge the debt publicly. A gift should be accepted only if the recipient were willing to invite the whole city to witness it. One party would thus enjoy the benefit itself, the other party the prestige that came from the ability to confer services which were highly valued and could not be remunerated. But gratitude involves more than a subjective feeling and more than words. The recipient of a favor seeks opportunities to be of service to the patron, and ideally places loyalty to the patron above any considerations of personal advantage. According to Seneca, it is the ungrateful person who thinks, I should have liked to return gratitude, but I fear the expense. I fear the danger. I shrink from giving offense. I would rather consult my own interest. He provides a powerful picture of the intense bond that gratitude ought to create between a recipient and a giver. No one can be grateful unless he or she has learned to scorn the things which drive the common herd to distraction. If you wish to make a return for a favor, you must be willing to go into exile, or to pour forth your blood, or to undergo poverty, or even to let your very innocence be stained and exposed to shameful slanders. Gratitude involves an intense loyalty to the person from whom one has received beneficence, such that one would place a greater value on service to the benefactor than on one's place in one's homeland, one's physical well-being, one's wealth, and one's reputation. It is important to stress that the logic of reciprocity is socially learned logic. It is imprinted on people in the 1st century Mediterranean world through socially observed and socially practiced behavior, by means of which 1st century people learned about how relationships work, how the world works, what values are part of the very foundation of life together. It is also reinforced in the literature of the cultures that constitute the Greco-Roman world, including Egyptian, Hebrew, Greek, and Latin literature. The point, however, is that it is also primarily reinforced not just in what is read, but what is observed in daily social interactions and communications. A child notices how his parents interact with people who have helped the family in some way. He accompanies his father out into the public spaces and notices how others treat his father with honor, and perhaps asks why. As a child grows, he notices dedicatory inscriptions giving public honors to people who have performed some service, or provided private funds for some public building throughout his city, and hears proclamations made declaring new honors for emperor, or governor, or civic patron. When he receives a favor, those closest to him stimulate his thinking about how to respond, and about the importance of responding, and so on. This formative process of social education shapes that child's thinking throughout his adult life. He will bring this knowledge into any new situation where the social dynamics appear to him to be similar. As a kind of side note, I want to say a few things about another prominent and very important word group in the New Testament, that is the vocabulary of faith or trust, pistis, and its opposite, distrust, apistia. These words were also very much at home in patron-client and friendship relations. Like grace, these words also carry multiple senses. Pistis looked to a friend or a patron with assurance of that patron's reliability to give what was promised. and in this sense it is usually translated as trust or faith. Pistis also manifested the client's dependability, keeping faith in the sense of showing loyalty and commitment to the patron and to his or her obligations of gratitude. In this context, then, pistis speaks to the firmness, reliability, and faithfulness of both parties in the patron-client relationship or the relationship of friends. Richard Saller, in a very important book on personal patronage in the early Roman Empire, observed that friendship, whether between equals or between unequal persons, in which it would be a patron-client relationship, was supposed to be founded on virtue, especially fides, the Latin word fides meaning faith or faithfulness, like the Greek word pistis, to which the author of Hebrews, for example, enjoins his readers through both negative and positive models, through warnings and exhortations. The opposite of pistis, trust or loyalty, is apistia. In one sense, this refers to distrust in regard to a patron's or friend's or client's reliability. Distrust springs from a prior negative evaluation of the character and reliability of the other person, and could be insulting in the extreme if the object of distrust were, in fact, a virtuous and trustworthy entity. However, one also had to be prudent when placing trust or committing oneself to be relied upon by another. In this regard, Dio's 73rd and 74th orations on trust and on distrust are very informative. Apistia could also refer, in a second sense, to disloyalty or unfaithfulness, as when clients fail to remain steadfast in their commitment to their patron or prove untrustworthy in their service. When persons from this world, a world where webs of friendship or patron-client relationships are a principal weave in the social fabric, read a text like Hebrews, they encounter a text that speaks of the immense benefits that God had given and the greater benefits that God promised for the future. They would have encountered a portrayal of Jesus, first and foremost, as a mesites, a mediator, who brings people before God to experience God's favor, God's timely help. Jesus' relationship to God as Son assures successful mediation or brokerage. The priestly and sacrificial language in Hebrews doesn't obscure or displace the essential dynamic that would be evident to all first-century hearers. Jesus stands between human beings in need of God's favor and the God who has all that the human beings could need or want. And Jesus has done and continues to do whatever it takes to connect the people with the experience of God's saving help and the reception of God's eternal promises. According to the Roman historian Barbara Levick, and it is indeed interesting to me to find a Roman historian also looking at the phenomenon of early Christianity in these same terms, Christianity, quote, gave access through an incorruptible intermediary to a reliable authority, an important offering indeed in a patronal society, end quote. Our ancient audience would also well understand the author of Hebrews' call for a suitable response. Since we are in the process of receiving an unshakable kingdom, let us show gratitude. And the attentive listener might notice that I gave the participle that occurs at this point, the present participle, an in-process translation highlighting the aspect of that participle, because I think that's quite relevant. We haven't received it yet, but we are in the process of receiving this immense favor. Because of that, let us show gratitude. The hearers of Hebrews would wince at the ungraceful and distrustful responses of the wilderness generation or of Esau to the privileges accorded them. They would shudder at the prospect of making such a response themselves that shows a lack of trust in the divine patron regarding the Christian hope, or a lack of gratitude for the investment God and God's Son have already made in their deliverance. The author's genius lies in foregrounding this theological, this ideological perspective on the audience's life choices, so that the hearers will continue to choose temporal loss for the sake of connection with their divine patron, rather than sink back into the embrace of their neighbors and the groups from which they dissociated themselves in their conversion and socialization process. As we continue to read, then, New Testament texts, especially those that talk about grace, and those that talk about, in many instances, faith, we would do well to keep in mind not just the dictionary meanings of these words, but also the lived social contexts of these words, because they might provide us with the native framework that an author like Paul and the hearers of Paul's letters, for example, brought to a text like Galatians or Romans. And if we keep these real-life social frameworks in mind and the values that accompany those frameworks, we might leave the reading of Galatians or Romans with a much better integrated sense of how grace and response, how divine gift and human discipleship must go hand in hand. That being saved by grace doesn't mean being saved by a transaction which ends with my receiving something from God, but by being saved by a relationship which begins with my receiving something from God, but continues as I respond appropriately to God's gift, and as God continues to grant favor and continues to offer the help that I need to grow into the righteous person that Christ coming to life within me seeks to bring about. Of course, this is a huge concept, and you would do very well to make it a part of your ongoing education for the sake of reading Scripture well, to read some of the ancient witnesses to the grace relationship in the Greek and Roman world. And I have listed here 4 of the most important sources that I've found in my own work. And then also there are a number of modern studies that bring this together and bring it to bear on reading the New Testament. No one lights a candle to stick it under a bushel, so I will say that the 3rd and 4th chapters of my book, Honor, Patronage, Kinship, and Purity, try to bring this background together in a coherent and clear way, and to give a broad sweeping view of how this makes a difference in our reading of actual interactions in the Gospels, for example, or behind the situations of the epistles, or think about the theology and the ethics of the New Testament. But of course, beyond that rather basic study, there are a number of other more detailed, more scholarly studies to be explored, and in particular, I would point to Richard Saller's book, Personal Patronage on the Early Empire, for a sense of the Roman workings of patronage in the 1st century, and James Harrison's really fine study of grace language in Paul, in the Pauline corpus, for a shorter immersion into that. Trels Engbert Peterson's article on gift giving and friendship looking at Romans 1 through 8 in the light of um, grace as a Greco-Roman social value is also of great help.